The dust from the stagecoach had barely settled when Jacob McAllister realized something was wrong. He'd been waiting at the edge of town for 3 hours, his best shirt buttoned tight despite the Montana heat, a small bouquet of wildflowers wilting in his calloused hands. The other mail order brides had disembarked with their trunks and hatboxes, rushing into the arms of nervous ranchers and miners. But there was no Catherine Wells, no one matching the description from her letters: petite, dark-haired, 23 years old. The driver shook his head when Jacob asked, "Just those 4, mister? Nobody else on board from St. Louis?" Jacob's chest tightened. 6 months of correspondence, carefully saved dollars for her passage, dreams spun from ink and paper, all of it crumbling like the dry earth beneath his boots. He mounted his horse and started the long ride back to his ranch, the flowers scattered on the road behind him. The creek that ran through the eastern edge of his property was usually dry this time of year, but recent rains had left it trickling with muddy water. Jacob often rode this way, checking the fence line, and that's where he saw her. At first, he thought it was a bundle of discarded clothes caught in the rocks. Then he saw the hand, pale and unmoving, fingers trailing in the water. He was off his horse before conscious thought could catch up to instinct. The woman lay half in the creek, her dress torn and filthy, one leg bent at an unnatural angle beneath her. Her face was turned toward the sky, lips cracked and bleeding, skin burned raw by the sun. But it was her eyes, when they fluttered open at his approach, that stopped his heart. They were the exact shade of amber she'd described in her 3rd letter. Catherine, the whisper that escaped her throat was barely human. Mr. McAllister, he'd imagined their first meeting 1,000 times. In none of those imaginings was she broken and dying in a creek bed, miles from anywhere she should have been. What happened? He knelt beside her, afraid to touch her, afraid not to. The stagecoach, they said you weren't on it. Her eyes closed, and for a terrible moment he thought she'd died. Then her lips moved again, stopped, men with guns, Iran, fell. Each word seemed to cost her everything. Days ago, maybe 3 days, she'd been lying here for 3 days. Jacob had served in the cavalry before claiming his homestead. He'd seen men die from thirst, from exposure, from wounds far less severe than what he suspected Catherine had suffered. The merciful thing, the practical thing, would be to make her comfortable and ride for the doctor in town. A 2-hour trip each way. She'd be dead before he made it back. Even if she wasn't, infection would have set in too deep to matter. He looked at her leg, at the fever flush on her cheeks, at the flies already gathering around her wounds. Catherine Wells had traveled 1,500 miles to marry a stranger and build a life in a hard land. She'd been robbed, abandoned, and left to die alone. The very least she deserved was someone to stay with her at the end. But as Jacob wetted his bandana in the creek and dabbed at her cracked lips, as he shooed away the flies and whispered meaningless comforts, something stubborn and unreasonable rose up in his chest. He'd lost his parents to cholera, his brother to the war, and his first attempt at ranching to a winter that killed half his herd. He was tired of loss, tired of giving up, tired of accepting that death got to win. "Miss Wells," he said, his voice steady even as his hands shook. "Catherine, I'm going to move you now. It's going to hurt something fierce, and I'm sorry for that. But I'm not leaving you here." Her eyes opened again, focusing on him with effort. "You should. Well, I'm not known for doing what I should." He shrugged out of his coat despite the heat and laid it on the ground beside her. "I'm known for being stubborn as a mule with twice the temper. Fair warning for the woman who's about to become my wife." The ghost of something that might have been a smile touched her lips. Then he lifted her, and she screamed. The ride back to the ranch house was 2 miles of carefully managed agony. Jacob had fashioned a crude splint for her leg using branches and strips torn from his shirt, but every step his horse took jarred her broken body. She passed out twice, which Jacob counted as a mercy. When she was conscious, she bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming, tears streaming silently down her temples into her matted hair. His ranch house was small. 3 rooms he'd built himself from timber he'd cut and stones he'd hauled. The bedroom barely fit his narrow bed, but he laid her there on sheets he'd washed just that morning in anticipation of a wedding night that had transformed into something entirely different. Jacob had delivered calves and foaled horses. He'd dug bullets out of his own leg after a skirmish with rustlers. But he'd never set a human bone, never treated injuries this severe. His hands moved with a confidence he didn't feel, cutting away her ruined dress, cleaning wounds with whiskey that made her convulse even in unconsciousness, straightening the leg as best he could, while sweat poured down his face. When he was done, he sat on the floor beside the bed, his head in his hands, and allowed himself 30 seconds of despair. Then he stood up, boiled water, made broth from the chicken he'd planned to serve at their wedding supper, and began the vigil. The fever came that night as he'd known it would. Catherine thrashed and mumbled, crying out for her mother, for someone named Elizabeth, for water, for mercy. Jacob bathed her with cool cloths, spooned water between her lips when she'd take it, and held her hand through the worst of the delirium. In her ravings, he learned things her careful letters had never revealed, that she'd been disowned by her family for refusing to marry her father's choice, that her sister had died in childbirth, that she was terrified of being a burden, of being unloved, of dying unmissed. "You're not a burden," he told her unconscious form, "and you won't die. I won't allow it." On the second day, he thought he'd lost her. Her breathing grew shallow, her pulse thread-like beneath his fingers. He found himself praying to a God he'd stopped talking to after his brother died, making bargains and promises he had no authority to make. Let her live, and he'd be the husband she deserved. Let her live, and he'd build her the house she'd described in her letters, with glass windows and a real wood floor. Let her live, and he'd spend every day earning the trust she'd placed in a stranger's advertisement. She didn't wake that day or the next. Jacob left her side only to tend his animals and fetch water from the well. He slept in the chair beside the bed, jerking awake at every change in her breathing. He read her letters aloud to her still form, all the things she'd written about her hopes and dreams, her fears and failures. He told her about his ranch, about the mountains she could see from the north window, about the wildflowers that would bloom in the spring. He talked until his voice was hoarse, because silence felt too much like surrender. On the 4th morning, he woke to find her watching him. Her eyes were clearer than they'd been since he found her, though shadowed with pain and confusion. "You're real," she whispered. "I thought I dreamed you." Jacob's throat constricted. "I'm real. How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by horses." She tried to shift and gasped. "My leg broken. I set it as best I could. You'll need a proper doctor to check my work, but I think it'll heal." He poured water from the pitcher, his hands unsteady. "You had a fever for 3 days. I wasn't sure." He couldn't finish the sentence. Catherine accepted the water gratefully, drinking in small sips. When she was done, she studied him with those amber eyes. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed. You could have left me in the creek, saved yourself the trouble." The matter-of-fact way she said it struck him like a physical blow. "What kind of man do you think I am?" "I don't know what kind of man you are. We've never met." But there was no accusation in her voice, just honest confusion. "Why did you save me?" Jacob pulled the chair closer to the bed, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. You want the practical answer or the true one? Both. Practically speaking, I paid for your passage out here, wrote you for 6 months, made plans. Seemed a waste to let all that go just because things didn't start out as expected. He managed a small smile. True answer, I read your letters, every one, so many times I near about memorized them. The woman who wrote those letters, who left everything she knew for a chance at something better, who admitted her fears but came anyway, that woman deserved someone to fight for her, even if the fight was just keeping her alive. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. I'm not the woman in those letters. I try to be, but I'm not. I'm broken now, crippled. I'll be a burden on you, assuming I even survive. You should send me back to St. Louis while you still can. Can't do that. Why not? Already sent word to the minister. We're getting married soon as you're well enough to say I do. Figure you can manage that much even flat on your back. He said it lightly, but his eyes were serious. Unless you don't want to marry me, that's different. That's your choice, and I'll respect it. But don't make that choice because you think you're damaged goods. You survived something that should have killed you. That's not weakness, Catherine. That's strength. She was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read truth there. What if I can't walk again? What if my leg doesn't heal right? Then I'll carry you when you need carrying. What if I can't do the work a ranch wife should do? Then we'll figure out what you can do and make that enough. What if you regret this, regret me? Jacob reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. Her fingers were thin and fragile in his calloused palm, but they curled around his with surprising strength. I might regret a lot of things in my life, Catherine Wells. I regret not being home when my mother got sick. I regret the men I killed in the war who maybe didn't need killing. I regret every harsh word I said to my brother before he died. He met her eyes steadily. But I will never regret pulling you out of that creek. And I will never regret asking you to be my wife. That's a promise I can make and keep. The tears spilled over then, running down her cheeks into the pillow. Jacob wanted to wipe them away, but sensed she needed to cry, needed to release the terror and pain and desperate hope she'd been holding inside. So he just held her hand and waited. I do, she finally whispered. He blinked. You do what? I do want to marry you. I came all this way for that, and broken leg or not, I intend to see it through. She squeezed his hand, but I need you to know. I'm scared. Scared of being useless. Scared that you'll wake up one day and realize you made a terrible mistake. Everyone's scared on their wedding day. Jacob said gently, I'm terrified. But we'll be terrified together, and that's better than being terrified alone. The minister came a week later, making the trip out to the ranch as a special favor. Catherine wore a nightgown Jacob had bought from the general store, her hair finely clean and braided, her legs still splinted and immobile beneath the blankets. She was pale and thin, but her eyes were bright as Jacob stood beside the bed and took her hand. The ceremony was simple. No guests, no flowers, no wedding feast. Just two people making promises in a rough, hewn bedroom while the Montana wind whistled through the gap in the walls. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Jacob leaned down carefully and kissed Catherine's forehead, not trusting himself to do more with his emotions so close to the surface. Well, Mrs. McAllister, he said when the minister had gone, we're married now, properly and legally. What do you want to do first? Catherine laughed, the first real laugh he'd heard from her. I want to see the mountains. You said I could see them from the north window. Jacob carried her to the window, chair and all, and held back the curtain so she could look out at the peaks still capped with snow even in summer. She was quiet for a long time, just looking. It's beautiful, she finally said, even more than I imagined. You'll see them every day. When you're healed, I'll take you up there. There's a meadow about halfway up where the wildflowers grow so thick you can't see the ground. Thought maybe we could build our house there, the one you described in your letters. That was just a dream. Dreams are important. They're worth building toward. He set her down gently. You rest now. I've got evening chores, but I'll be back to make supper. Jacob. She caught his hand as he turned to go. Thank you for everything, for not giving up on me. I told you I was stubborn. He smiled. Besides, you're my wife now. In sickness and in health, remember. This is just the sickness part. We've got the health part to look forward to. The healing was slow and painful. The doctor who finally examined Catherine's leg 2 weeks later was impressed with Jacob's work, but warned that she might always walk with a limp. There was talk of nerve damage, of complications, of realistic expectations. Jacob listened and nodded, and then promptly ignored every word of discouragement. He fashioned crutches from oak branches and taught Catherine to use them. When she fell, and she fell often those first weeks, he helped her up without fuss or pity, just steady hands and quiet encouragement. When she wept from frustration, he let her cry, and then told her about the time he'd broken his arm and convinced himself he'd never ranch again. Turns out the thing you're sure will defeat you often doesn't, he said. You're stronger than you think, Catherine. You just need time to remember it. Summer faded into fall, and Catherine grew stronger. She graduated from the bed to the chair to the crutches to, finally, halting steps with only a cane for support. The limp the doctor predicted materialized, but it was less pronounced than feared. More importantly, she learned to work around it. She couldn't do heavy ranch work, but she could tend the kitchen garden Jacob planted near the house. She couldn't ride for hours checking fence lines, but she could keep the books and handle correspondence with buyers. She couldn't lift heavy loads, but she could cook and preserve and plan. Slowly, almost without either of them noticing, she became not just his wife but his partner. The nightmares came sometimes. Dreams of the robbery, of lying broken in the creek, of dying alone and forgotten. On those nights, Jacob would wake to find her trembling beside him and pull her close, whispering reassurances until she calmed. He never complained, never suggested she should be over it by now. He'd seen enough men haunted by war to know that some fears didn't leave on a schedule. Winter arrived hard and early that year. Snow piled 6 feet deep around the house, and the temperature dropped so low that water froze in the bucket overnight. Jacob worried about Catherine's leg in the cold, about her health, about their dwindling supplies, but she surprised him. I survived a robbery and 3 days dying in a creek, she said when he suggested she stay in bed to conserve warmth. I'm not going to be defeated by a little snow. She learned to knit from memory of her mother's teaching, making socks and scarves that actually kept them warm. She experimented with their limited supplies and created meals that made their stores stretch further than Jacob thought possible. She sang while she worked, badly, she admitted, but cheerfully, and filled the small house with something it had never contained before, laughter. One evening in late January, nearly 6 months after he'd found her in the creek, Jacob came in from feeding the animals to find the table set with their best dishes, and Catherine wearing the dress he'd bought her for church. What's the occasion? He asked, brushing snow from his coat. It's our 6th-month anniversary. 6 months since you pulled me out of that creek and saved my life. Technically, we've only been married 5 months. I'm counting from when you chose me, when you could have left me to die and didn't. She smiled, and Jacob's heart did something complicated in his chest. I wanted to thank you properly. Catherine, you don't need to. Yes, I do. She crossed to him, moving with barely a hitch in her step now. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about being strong, about dreams being worth building toward. I think I finally understand what you meant. What's that? Strength isn't about being perfect or undamaged. It's about getting up after you fall, And dreams aren't about having everything go according to plan. They're about making something good out of whatever life gives you." She took his hands. "You gave me a life when I should have died. But more than that, you gave me a reason to want that life. You saw me at my absolute worst, broken and useless and afraid. And you didn't turn away. You stayed, you fought for me, and then you kept fighting with me until I could fight for myself." Jacob's throat was tight. "You were never useless. I felt useless. That's what mattered. But you treated me like I was worth something, worth saving, worth staying for. And eventually,